The Nigerian government just made a move that sent shockwaves through international finance circles. In a stunning reversal of decades-long policy, Africa's largest economy announced it would begin distancing itself from Western-dominated financial institutions. For leaders watching from Pyongyang to Ouagadougou, this wasn't just an economic decision. It was validation. Kim Jong-un's regime has spent 70 years building an entire state apparatus around the principle of juche, complete economic self-reliance born from deep distrust of external financial systems. North Korea's isolation wasn't always voluntary, but its leadership transformed necessity into ideology. When Nigerian officials began questioning their relationship with the IMF and World Bank, Pyongyang saw a familiar script playing out. The rhetoric matters less than the precedent. A major African economy publicly challenging the Bretton Woods architecture represents exactly what North Korea has long argued: that Western financial institutions are instruments of control, not development. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understands this calculus differently, but arrives at the same conclusion. Since seizing power in Burkina Faso through a military coup in September 2022, the 34-year-old officer has positioned himself as the voice of a new African generation tired of conditional aid and structural adjustment programs. His speeches echo with frustration at sovereignty constrained by debt obligations and policy prescriptions written in Washington. When Nigeria, a nation with genuine economic weight and regional influence, begins articulating similar concerns, it amplifies Traoré's message exponentially. The timing matters. Nigeria's economy has struggled under crushing debt servicing costs, with over 90% of government revenue reportedly going toward debt payments in recent periods. The naira has collapsed. Inflation has devastated household purchasing power, and the conditions attached to international loans, demanding subsidy removals and austerity measures, have triggered widespread social unrest. From Traoré's perspective in Ouagadougou, this validates everything he's been saying. The Western financial model doesn't deliver prosperity. It delivers dependency. Both leaders would frame Nigeria's shift as confirming a larger truth about the global economic order. The IMF and World Bank, despite their stated development missions, operate with conditionalities that fundamentally limit a nation's ability to chart its own economic course. Loan agreements come with requirements: privatize state assets, remove fuel subsidies, liberalize markets, adopt specific monetary policies. These aren't neutral technical recommendations. They're political choices that shape how economies function and who benefits. For North Korea, the lesson learned through brutal experience is that any external financial relationship creates leverage points for coercion. Sanctions, aid cutoffs, and conditional lending all become tools of geopolitical pressure. Nigeria's move, even if partial or symbolic, represents a major economy acknowledging this reality. It suggests that the costs of participating in Western-led financial systems might outweigh the benefits, particularly for nations with sufficient natural resources and domestic markets to potentially chart alternative paths. Traoré's interpretation carries additional regional dimensions. Across the Sahel, a pattern has emerged. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have all experienced military coups followed by pivots away from traditional Western partnerships. Economic frustration, particularly among young populations facing unemployment and inflation despite years of IMF programs, provided fertile ground for these upheavals. If Nigeria, the regional economic giant, begins questioning the same framework, it potentially legitimizes the Sahel's broader rejection of Western institutional influence. The geopolitical implications extend beyond symbolism. Nigeria controls Africa's largest economy, its biggest population, and massive oil reserves. Its relationship with international financial institutions matters for regional stability, debt markets, and the broader credibility of the Bretton Woods system in Africa. Other nations watching include those already operating outside Western financial norms, China's Belt and Road partners, exploring alternative development models, and commodity exporters calculating whether they need Washington's approval to restructure their economies. This is where the calculation becomes dangerous. Economic sovereignty sounds appealing until you're cut off from international capital markets during a crisis. North Korea achieved independence from Western finance, but at the cost of chronic poverty and total isolation. The question Nigeria now faces, and that Traore and Kim would answer very differently, is whether there's a middle path. Can a nation selectively engage with international institutions while maintaining genuine policy autonomy? Or does the architecture of global finance make that impossible? What happens next will reveal whether Nigeria is making a strategic recalibration or taking the first step toward isolation it cannot reverse. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sees something in Nigeria that most Western analysts refuse to acknowledge. Africa's largest economy possesses everything needed to anchor a completely independent regional financial architecture. 220 million people. Proven oil reserves exceeding 37 billion barrels. Gas deposits that could power industrial transformation across West Africa. Existing port infrastructure, telecommunications networks, and a domestic market large enough to absorb regional production. The pieces are already on the board. What's been missing is the political will to move them. For Traore, Nigeria's potential pivot away from Western financial institutions isn't just symbolic resistance. It's the foundation for something far more ambitious. The alliance of Sahel states, formed between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after their successive military coups, currently operates as a security and political confederation. But without economic heft, any alliance remains vulnerable to external pressure. Nigeria changes that calculation entirely. If Africa's largest economy begins prioritizing regional integration over Western institutional approval, the AES transforms from a rebellious bloc into a viable alternative economic zone. The model Traore envisions centers on state-led development, a direct rejection of the privatization orthodoxy that's dominated African policy for decades. Nigeria's oil sector, despite corruption and mismanagement, still generates massive revenue flows. Traore would argue those resources should capitalize a regional development bank, an institution designed specifically to fund infrastructure projects across West Africa without the conditionalities attached to World Bank loans. Roads connecting Lagos to Niamey. Energy grids linking Nigerian gas fields to Sahelian cities. Agricultural processing facilities that add value before export. This isn't theoretical. China built similar infrastructure-focused development banks and used them to transform entire regions. Resource nationalism forms the second pillar of Traore's vision. Burkina Faso has already moved to renegotiate mining contracts, demanding higher royalties and greater state participation in gold extraction. Mali has taken similar steps. But these remain relatively small economies with limited leverage against multinational corporations. Nigeria operates at a completely different scale. If Nigerian leadership adopted genuine resource nationalism, insisting on majority state ownership in oil projects, local refining requirements, and technology transfer agreements, it would set a precedent that reshapes how extractive industries function across Africa. Traore understands that individual Sahel states lack the market power to force these changes. Nigeria doesn't. The CFA franc issue adds another dimension. 8 West African nations still use a currency directly pegged to the euro, with monetary policy effectively controlled from Paris. Traore has called this arrangement a continuation of colonial economics by other means. The AES states have discussed creating an alternative currency, but launching a credible regional monetary system requires an anchor economy with sufficient reserves and trade volume. Nigeria, for all its economic challenges, conducts more trade than the entire Sahel combined. A Nigeria-backed regional currency, potentially linked to oil and gas exports rather than European monetary policy, could offer a genuine alternative to CFA dependence. This is where the stakes become clear. Traore isn't proposing minor policy adjustments. He's articulating a vision for economic architecture that operates independently of Western financial systems. A regional development bank funded by Nigerian oil revenue. Infrastructure projects designed around African needs rather than donor priorities. resource extraction contracts that prioritize state revenue over foreign shareholder returns, monetary policy determined in Abuja or Ouagadougou instead of Washington or Paris. The obstacles are enormous. Nigeria's own governance challenges, corruption networks embedded in the oil sector, and existing debt obligations all complicate any dramatic policy shift. The Sahel states themselves face security crises that consume resources and destabilize economies. Western powers and international financial institutions would likely respond to serious regional integration efforts with economic pressure, potentially including sanctions or reduced market access. And internal political opposition within Nigeria, particularly from elites benefiting from current arrangements, would resist fundamental restructuring. But Traoré's argument doesn't rest on easy implementation. It rests on necessity. He would point to decades of IMF structural adjustment programs that failed to generate sustainable development, trade agreements that turned African nations into raw material exporters while importing finished goods, debt cycles that transfer wealth from African populations to international creditors. From his perspective, the current system isn't working and never will. The question isn't whether change is difficult. The question is whether the alternative, continued subordination within Western-dominated financial frameworks, remains acceptable. What happens next depends entirely on whether Nigerian leadership shares Traoré's diagnosis. If they do, West Africa could be watching the early stages of the most significant economic realignment since independence. If they don't, the AES remains isolated, and Traoré's vision stays rhetorical. But either way, the fact that this conversation is even happening signals something fundamental has shifted in how African leaders think about economic sovereignty. North Korea has been economically isolated for 73 years. Its leadership survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, endured decades of international sanctions, weathered famines that killed hundreds of thousands, and built a nuclear weapons program while cut off from global financial systems. If Nigeria is seriously considering distancing itself from Western-dominated institutions, Pyongyang has a message. The pressure will be brutal, but you can survive it. The North Korean model isn't aspirational. It's a warning wrapped in a survival manual. When Kim Il-sung introduced Jewish ideology in the 1950s, it emerged from genuine strategic necessity. Soviet patronage was unreliable. Chinese support came with strings attached. And the United States maintained a military presence just kilometers from Pyongyang, backed by an alliance system designed to contain and isolate the regime. Self-reliance wasn't a choice. It was the only option left after every other path closed. Nigeria isn't North Korea, and the situations aren't equivalent. But the fundamental dynamic Pyongyang would highlight remains relevant. When a nation challenges Western economic hegemony, the institutional response follows a predictable pattern. First comes diplomatic pressure. International financial institutions express concern about policy direction. Credit ratings agencies issue warnings. Development partners threaten to reconsider funding commitments. This stage is designed to create political costs domestically, turning business elites and middle-class populations against leadership pursuing economic independence. If diplomatic pressure fails, the economic tools deploy. Access to dollar clearing systems gets restricted. Correspondent banking relationships face enhanced scrutiny. Export markets encounter sudden regulatory barriers. International bond markets price in massive risk premiums, making external borrowing prohibitively expensive. North Korea experienced all of this and more. Sanctions eventually became so comprehensive that the country operates almost entirely outside the formal global economy. For Nigeria, with an economy deeply integrated into international trade and finance, even partial versions of these measures would inflict serious damage. This is where North Korea's experience becomes instructive, not as a model to emulate, but as a case study in adaptation. Pyongyang developed several strategies to maintain economic function under extreme isolation. Domestic production capacity, however inefficient, replaced imports for essential goods. Barter trade with sympathetic nations substituted for dollar-denominated commerce. black market networks and sanctions evasion schemes filled gaps in the official economy. Most critically, the regime cultivated strategic partnerships with countries willing to engage outside Western frameworks, primarily China and Russia, creating alternative sources of trade, investment, and diplomatic cover. The ideological component matters as much as the practical adaptation. Juche isn't just economic policy. It's a comprehensive narrative explaining why isolation exists and why enduring hardship serves national dignity. North Korean leadership would likely counsel Nigerian counterparts that Western pushback isn't evidence of wrong policy choices. It's confirmation that those policies threaten entrenched interests. The pain inflicted through economic pressure becomes reframed as the cost of genuine sovereignty, something worth bearing if the alternative is perpetual subordination. But here's the calculation Nigeria would need to face directly. North Korea's population is 26 million. Nigeria's exceeds 220 million. North Korea's economy, even before sanctions, was small and largely agricultural. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy with massive oil exports, complex supply chains, and integration into global markets that North Korea never experienced. The scale of disruption from Western economic retaliation would be exponentially larger. Popular tolerance for hardship, particularly in a country where economic frustration already drives political instability, might not match North Korean endurance levels shaped by decades of authoritarian control and ideological conditioning. North Korea would also emphasize the importance of alternative partnerships. Its survival depended heavily on Chinese economic support and Russian diplomatic protection. For Nigeria, cultivating relationships with Beijing, Moscow, and potentially Gulf states would become essential if Western economic ties deteriorate. But those partnerships come with their own dependencies and strings, just different ones. Trading IMF conditionalities for Chinese debt trap dynamics or Russian geopolitical alignments doesn't necessarily deliver more sovereignty, just different constraints. The cost of independence has a price tag, and it's higher than most governments are willing to admit. If Nigeria moves forward with distancing itself from Western financial institutions, the immediate economic consequences aren't theoretical. They're guaranteed. Capital flight as foreign investors pull billions from Nigerian markets. Currency collapse as forex reserves drain and the naira loses what stability it has left. Inflation surging as import costs skyrocket and supply chains rupture. Trade disruptions when correspondent banks refuse to clear Nigerian transactions. This isn't fear-mongering. It's the documented pattern that follows every serious challenge to the Western-dominated financial order. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré and North Korea's regime understand these costs intimately. They've lived them, but their argument doesn't deny the pain. It reframes it. From their perspective, short-term economic hardship is the unavoidable price of breaking free from a system designed to extract wealth while maintaining dependency. The suffering is real, but it's temporary and purposeful. The withdrawal symptoms of an economy detoxifying from structural subordination. What matters isn't avoiding pain, but ensuring that pain leads somewhere, that it purchases something worth having. Genuine control over national resources, the ability to set economic policy without external veto, and membership in a new axis of Southern economies, trading, and developing outside Western oversight. This narrative has power, especially in nations where decades of IMF programs failed to deliver promised prosperity. Nigeria has played by the rules. It opened markets, privatized state assets, removed fuel subsidies when told, and maintained relationships with international creditors. The result? Crushing debt, persistent poverty, and an economy that generates massive oil revenue, while most citizens struggle to afford basic necessities. If the current path doesn't work, the argument for trying something radically different gains traction regardless of the risks involved. The promised long-term gains center on resource sovereignty and alternative partnerships. Nigeria sits on Africa's largest proven oil reserves and massive natural gas deposits. Under the current system, extraction is dominated by international oil companies operating under contracts negotiated when Nigeria had less leverage. Revenue sharing favors foreign corporations. Technology transfer remains limited. And profits extracted from Nigerian resources finance development elsewhere. Traore's vision involves renegotiating this entire framework, demanding majority state ownership, insisting on local refining capacity, and using resource revenue to capitalize regional development instead of servicing international debt. The South-South economic axis represents the other pillar of this strategy. China, India, Russia, Gulf states, and increasingly cohesive blocs like BRICS offer alternative sources of investment, trade, and technology transfer. These relationships come with their own conditions, but proponents argue the conditionalities differ fundamentally from Western institutional demands. Beijing doesn't require democratic reforms or austerity measures. It wants infrastructure contracts and resource access. Moscow offers military hardware and diplomatic cover. Gulf capital seeks investment returns without political interference. For nations willing to navigate multiple partnerships strategically, this creates room for maneuver that simply doesn't exist within Western-dominated frameworks. But here's where the calculation becomes treacherous. Every historical example of this path shows the same vulnerabilities. Deep international isolation that extends beyond economics into technology, security, and diplomatic standing. Foreign investment drying up as risk premiums make projects unviable. Technology gaps widening as access to cutting-edge systems gets restricted. Growth stalling as economies cut off from global value chains struggle to achieve scale. North Korea survived isolation but never thrived under it. Venezuela tried building alternative partnerships and ended up dependent on China and Russia, while its economy collapsed. Zimbabwe pursued resource nationalism and watched agricultural output crater. Success, if it's possible at all, depends entirely on factors that are extraordinarily difficult to sustain. Governance must be competent, disciplined, and relatively uncorrupted precisely when economic pressure creates massive incentives for elite looting. Regional unity must hold when individual nations face different pressure levels and temptations to defect for bilateral advantages. Domestic populations must tolerate years of hardship while waiting for promised long-term gains that might never materialize. And alternative partnerships must prove reliable and genuinely beneficial rather than simply replacing Western dependency with Eastern or Southern versions of the same dynamic. This is the fundamental tension Nigeria would face. The critique of Western financial institutions is valid. The promise of genuine sovereignty is appealing. But the path from here to there runs through economic devastation that could destroy the political coalition attempting the transition before it achieves anything lasting. The question isn't whether independence is worth pursuing. The question is whether Nigeria has the state capacity, regional support, and popular endurance to survive the journey. Because once you start down this road, the options for turning back disappear faster than anyone expects.